Genetically modified organisms, also known as GMOs, include foods throughout the world. A GMO food is an organism whose genetic characteristics have been altered by the insertion of a modified gene or a gene from another organism with genetic engineering. The altered genes with DNA from a different living organism, such as bacteria or viruses, are inserted into the plant to get specific traits that might be resistant to disease or pesticides. We're given different reasons for why GMO foods were invented, primary reason being so that the plants could build resistance to herbicides that would kill the weeds, so the farmers could spray herbicides onto the foods and it would kill the weeds but not the plants. It's also so that the plants could be resistant to different diseases, so that they could last longer without spoiling. Maybe they could grow faster or larger, or they could be resistant to different bugs and pests that could invade the plant. Crossbreeding plants from one species to another has been done forever, such as different tomatoes being bred together to make a new type of tomato, and that's really called hybrid plants. So perhaps we could crossbreed a cherry tomato with a regular tomato and come up with a medium-sized tomato, and that's been done for years. And there's different varieties of plants and fruits and vegetables and grains that has been done for many, many, many years. However, genetically modifying them with genes from a different organism was first done in the 80s. In 1987, the first ever commercially grown genetically modified food was the Flavor Savor tomato. And what was happening here is that was inserted with DNA from a cold water fish so that the plant could survive in colder weather and produce more tomatoes before the plant actually died off. And at this point in time, there are many genetically modified foods in the food supply system throughout the world. Here you can see a list of some of those that are genetically modified. Most foods that are not on this list are not genetically modified at this time. But here, sugar from sugar beets, where we might get high fructose corn syrup. The corn in itself that's used for animal feed. So if the cows and pigs are eating that and then we're eating the meat from that, we would be getting some genetically modified traits through that. And then also soybeans or cotton plants, so that what's being made out of those are soybean oil or cottonseed oil. But you can see a long list of different foods, including cows that have been given different hormones, and cows are also eating the genetically modified foods. So if we read through this list, some of the more recent ones are the Arctic apples, where they will last longer without spoiling. Also salmon, so that they can grow at a quicker pace than regular salmon. But here's a list of them. And beware of the corn and oil, cottonseed soybean oils and high fructose corn syrup the most. So the question is, are genetically modified foods safe to eat, safe to give our animals, and then we eat those proteins from the animal? The U.S. government has approved genetically modified foods based on studies. Some of those studies were conducted by the individuals making the foods, but however, the United States government does deem them to be safe. Now, in more than 60 countries throughout the world, including most of the European Union, they are outlawed and they cannot grow or sell genetically modified foods. So there is some debate worldwide about whether or not this should be in the food supply system. It's hard to find objective research, scientific research on genetically modified foods because they're fairly new, and because also the companies that are making them do not want any negative scientific outcomes from the food that they're producing. But two sources that are pretty reliable that I have found are the American Academy of Environmental Medicine and also the World Health Organization. So you could look up the information from the World Health Organization. But the American Academy of Environmental Medicine states that because of the mounting data, it's biologically plausible that GMOs can cause adverse health effects in humans. And it is possible that the genetically modified foods could cause disease in patients and also environmental issues. And because they're so new, it's hard to test whether or not there's a cause and effect of consumption of genetically modified foods and disease. Individuals eat a wide variety of food on a daily basis. So it's hard to determine if one thing will cause disease. But some of the risks that might be involved with eating a large amount of GMOs in the food that we consume would be immune system damage or allergies, perhaps some belly aches. But those are some of the things that would be tested and that could potentially cause health issues. There are some theories that GMOs will provide environmental risks, and that the introduction of GMO crops have caused the deterioration or extinction of different bees and butterflies that are used to pollinate crops, that the toxins that are being sprayed on the crops, the pesticides and herbicides that are being sprayed on the crops in large amounts, the plant may be able to withstand them, but that's going into the environment. The herbicides, the pesticides, and the consumption of that might be dangerous. Also, it might damage native species. Some organic foods or foods that are conventional might be cross-contaminated with different GMO products. Maybe some also damage to the soil, damage to the environment where the plants are grown, and it may be harder to grow even regular crops after the GMO have been in that area. It is legal to grow genetically modified crops in the United States, as opposed to most of the European and Asian world where it is not legal. But the United States has passed a law stating that even if genetically modified foods have been shown later in life to cause disease or environmental damage, that the individuals who did receive those damages cannot sue any individual who had made the genetically modified foods. So it prohibits federal courts from banning the sale and planting of GMOs, even if they're proven to be dangerous to human health. So it appears GMOs are legal and also protected by the U.S. government, and they're in a wide source of foods that are processed. So if you're eating processed food, chances are you're eating genetically modified foods. High fructose corn syrup, trans fats with hydrogenated cottonseed oil or hydrogenated corn oil, hydrogenated soybean oil, those are all genetically modified. It says that 80% of processed food in the U.S. food supply system does have genetic modifications. So if you're eating boxed, packaged, canned foods, chances are you are getting genetically modified organisms in your diet. How to avoid them is to buy organic whole foods. If it is organic, then no product or no trait in that food should be genetically modified at all. That would go for the dairy and meat as well. The animal would not have eaten genetically modified grains. So buying organic, whole, and natural foods would be one way to avoid the genetically modified foods, which are very common in the processed food. And this chart shows a little bit about genetically modified foods, the science behind it, the prevalence of it, and it says you probably eat genetically modified foods every day. Most individuals want genetically modified foods to be labeled. However, in the United States, that's not required by the law. So you can actually be eating a food and not know whether it's genetically modified or not. So a lot of effort has gone into mandating the government impose a law which states that if there's genetically modified food in a product, it should be stated on the label. But as of right now, that is not being implemented. So best choice is to educate yourself of what are common genetically modified foods and what that might be put into in the processed food. And then also eating natural whole foods, perhaps even grown by yourself. In other parts of the world, this is not in the food supply system. So most of it is in Canada, Mexico, and the United States. In other areas, it's not permitted, so it's not in the food supply system as of today's date. So it's time to think of the pros and cons of genetically modified food. They're being purported by groups that are growing it, that they could solve world hunger, they could make more food, larger amounts of food to supply to the world, which could impact the hunger. It could also grow larger and more abundant crops just due to the fact that they're resistant to disease, they're resistant to pesticides and herbicides that are being sprayed on them. And then also you have to think of the cons. Will there be a health risk to humans? Will there be a health risk to the animals that we're eating? To damage to the environment? Or are the pesticides and herbicides that are being sprayed on the crops, are those dangerous to the human body? So in our discussion this week, we need to say the pros and cons of genetically modified foods, see if you could come up with some scientific evidence that you found within the electronic library at Triton or online, but something that's not biased. And remember, if a company is selling something, chances are they're biased, and that goes for the genetically modified food companies, but also for the organic companies, because they are selling their organic foods as well. So we try to find as least biased information as possible. It's quite difficult for genetically modified foods because they're fairly new, but look at sources that are from an educational standpoint, from universities, from organizations like the World Health Organization, that are just dealt with education and facts rather than anything that has to do with economic benefits.